the basics, what is a user story? So one thing to keep in mind is a user story is just a tool. That's all it is. And it's a tool to capture a description of a feature from the end user perspective. So it's very important to keep in mind not to get too overly technical with the user story. It should be something written from the point of view of the person who's going to benefit from your work that you're doing. And there are a few components that you want in your user story. There's the title. This is usually like that line that you see in Jira right at the top. So right after like the few letters, dash, and then the numbers, which is like the user story number or issue number or whatever it's called. You have the user story title. So there should be a short phrase or a short sentence, something basic, just describing what the story is about. And you want the who. So, and this is one example of how user stories are written because it's easy to not forget the different aspects of a good user story. So the who, what, and why, you can write it however you want. You can say, as a user of this app, I want to be able to pay my balance so that I don't get any late fees. That's just one way to do it. You can also just write it, bullet point it out. Who? The user. Why? This goal. What? As long as you just have those three aspects, and it should be fairly consistent from story to story within your squad. However you guys decide to do it, it should be consistent. So anyone else on the team who picks up the story and looks at it knows what they're looking at. And notice there's no how in the user story. So you're not looking for a solution here. You're purely looking for who, what, why. It should be like a short paragraph, one sentence. This is your story. But where do you put the how? When you start discussing like this is how we think this is going to go, and when you're in refinement and you're thinking like, no, this is the solution we're going to go with, those you can either list further down in the description of the user story if you're using Jira, or you can add them as subtasks or whatever. They just do not belong in the user story description of like who, what, and why. Okay. Acceptance criteria. This is something that is most often forgotten about. Um, and you basically want to have this set before you start working on the story, because you want to know, did we build the product right, and did we build the right product, and did we build it right? So how do you know that unless you have clear acceptance criteria of saying exactly what needs to be built? So there's kind of a checklist of things to keep in mind. With the acceptance criteria, it should be written prior to any development work. Of course, details are going to come out as you're working on the story. So as you're doing development or as you're testing, you're going to find more things and say, oh no, we forgot about this, and then they can be added. But you should have a good list of acceptance criteria before you get started. And the acceptance criteria should be a set of statements with a clear pass-fail result. So you should be able to look at it when the story is done and say, okay, did this happen? Yes or no? And if it's no, then the story is not done, right? If it's okay, when I click on here, then I click on here, then this happens. If that's not happening, then the story's not done and the acceptance criteria hasn't been met. So it shouldn't be anything vague or unclear. You should be able to easily look and see, is this done or not? And that will make your life much easier. And again, this should state intent, not a solution. So remember from the previous slide, the how you're going to implement this story is nowhere in the user story or acceptance criteria. It belongs either as subtasks or as attachments or additional notes, a reference to a Confluence page, however you want to do it. But when you put it in writing, in the story, in the acceptance criteria, then that leaves you very little wiggle room, because I'm sure any of you who have been doing IT long enough, you think you have a solution and you start working and realize we can't do it this way, we have to do it another way. And if it's already written in the acceptance criteria, this is the way it has to be done, then you have to, go back and change the story. And, it becomes a lot bigger nightmare instead of just saying, look, this is what needs to be done, get it done in the best way possible. And then that gives you some freedom to say, okay, well, I thought we were going to do it this way, but that's not possible the way we thought we could do it. So I'm going to change it and do it this other way. The story is still going to be done. And then if there's any issues with that, that's what the review is for. And then you can create a new story and so on. Okay. And it defines when the work is complete and the product is working as expected. So remember, I stated before that if you have stories that you are seeing go from sprint to sprint to sprint without being completed, a lot of times that's a lack of good acceptance criteria because people don't know when they're done. They think, okay, this feature is done. I think I'm done, but there's a few more things I need to do. I wasn't sure if this was included, so I went ahead and kept working on it. It should not be that way. If you have clear acceptance criteria, this is what's included, this is what is not included. So the that clear pass fail result could also be, okay, these are things that are not included in this. So if you have some huge epic that you're working on, sometimes it's necessary to say, okay, this is the feature we're working on, this is what needs to be included. These things are not included in this feature yet. These will be included later on, or that's coming, at a later date or in another story. It's fine. And so that way people that are testing and the people that are developing that it's not included. And they specify functional and non-functional requirements. And I'll say that the non-functional requirements, there's a little caveat to this because the non-functional requirements that would be in a story would be things that your particular team can test. So like the non-functional requirements would be like speed, accessibility, security, information, things like that. Like those would be something system-wide, and those should not be in your acceptance criteria because your team, unless you are the team that tests that, um, those types of requirements wouldn't belong in a user story. The only things that should be included in a user story are things that your team itself can test. And that helps you to prevent the situation where you're done and you're waiting for the other team to do their part, but you can't complete the story because it's not finished yet. So when you have an instance like that, like, hey, we're working on this story and we think it may affect, you know, accessibility for the site, you can create a separate task, not a subtask within the story, but a separate task in your backlog to remind yourself or remind the team, hey, when we're done with this, we need to ask this other team that testing that they need to run a check on accessibility or whatever it happens to be. So user story acceptance criteria can specify functional and non-functional requirements. Just be certain that you're specifying requirements that you yourself can test. Good. Good acceptance criteria are written so that testers can easily just take them and translate them into automated test cases. So this is really important while you're refining stories to get your testers involved and talk with developers and analysts and make sure everybody understands not only what needs to be developed, but what needs to be tested. And if your acceptance criteria is written really well, that should be something really easy for a tester to take and make automated test cases. And one of the ways to write acceptance criteria is the given, when, then. So given some situation, when this happens, then this happens. So given I have gone to George and entered in my login information and password, when I click on my accounts, then I am able to see the balances of all my accounts. So that's something really easy that a tester can take and make an automated test case out of it. No problem. Um, okay, so how do we know when a user story is written and ready to be pulled into a sprint? You have the three C's. So the card is the first thing. So Typically, these were written on like index cards or post-it notes. We enter them typically here in Jira. So however you want to document your user story, that's basically the card. So whether you do use post-it notes or entering it in Jira or whatever, it's basically documented somewhere. The second C is conversation. So we typically call this refinement. This is the conversation. It typically comes from, maybe the product owner is talking with the person requesting the feature. And then the conversation needs to happen with the team so everyone has the same understanding of what's going to happen, what needs to happen for the story to be completed. And then you have the confirmation, which is usually the kind of final nail in the coffin is the so once you've had a refinement, the team has come up with good acceptance criteria, the story is written well. Finally, you can do an estimate. Um, and if the whole team is able to come to an agreement on an estimate, then you have a pretty good idea that the entire team understands exactly what's required for the story to be done. So however that confirmation happens, for most teams, it would be the estimate. The other thing that we want to keep in mind with the invest criteria is these are things that you should keep in mind when you're writing the story. So before I start going through the invest criteria, I will preface all of this by saying these are things to keep in mind. They're not hard and fast rules. It's not like if you're missing one of them, you can't do the story, but they should be things in the back of your mind as you're refining the story and writing it and writing acceptance criteria and figuring out, what tests are going to be run. These are things that you should have in your mind. So we all know stories should be independent. So when you're writing a story, if you're seeing dependencies, you should do whatever you can to remove those dependencies if at all possible. Of course, I live in the same real world you guys do, so I know that's not always possible, but every effort should be made to try to have the stories independent. If you can't, if it's not possible, or if it's just going to be so absolutely time consuming to try to remove the dependency, just make sure the entire team is aware of that dependency and put it in Jira so that anyone else looking at your stories also knows that you are also aware of that dependency. And the N is that it's negotiable. So negotiable basically means like, remember I was saying you don't put the solution or how you're going to implement it into the story. So that's kind of the negotiable part. You have a story which is telling you what. This is what you're going to be building, for who, and why you're building it. The how is the negotiable part. How you get it done is totally up to you. So solution should not be written in the story. It should be valuable. You should be delivering something of value to the end user. So that value may be saving money. It could be making their life easier. There's a lot of different ways to determine its value. So in order for the story to be written, there's no hard and fast rule about how you determine the value of a user story. There are a lot of different ideas out there, but I just say that it needs to have some kind of value for why you're making this feature. And then it should be estimable. So the team should be able to have some idea of the size of the story, right? Even if you don't do estimates, even if your team doesn't do estimates right now, if they had to say this is small, medium, and large. Just if your team has never done estimates before, and they're refining a story, and at the very end you should be able to say, okay, you guys, compared to everything else in the backlog, do you think this story is small, medium, or large compared to everything else? And if somebody says small and someone says large, there's probably still some discrepancy and some questions that need to be answered about that story before you move forward. And it should be small. So the rule is that it should be completed in one sprint or less. So anywhere between a few days to one sprint, stories should be small enough that the team believes that they can complete it in one sprint. I know that's not always possible, but every effort should be made. So if there's a story where it's like, man, okay, we know we're not going to be able to get this finished in one sprint, but the team, we really have been trying and trying to figure out how to break this into something smaller, and there really isn't, a smart way to split the story, then okay, move on. But at least you've tried. At least this was in your mind. Hey, we don't think we're going to get this done in one sprint. Let's have the conversation. Let's talk with each other and try to figure out, is there a way to split it? Is there a way to, make two different stories? Is there a way to kind of pare down the scope of this feature to make it fit into one sprint and add the rest of the things later, or whatever? So again, we live in the real world. So these are just things that you need to keep in mind for a story. They should also be testable. How do you know if a story is done unless you can test to see that it's done? That makes sense. Okay, good. So a sample user story is like view credit card balance. As a credit card user, I want to be able to see my balance that I owe so that I can make a payment. So here you have the who, the what, and the why. And then I want to be able to have some acceptance criteria. Given I have entered my username and password, when I click on credit card info, then I can view my total balance. So that's something completely easy that someone who's doing the testing can make an automated test case out of this. And the correct balance is shown. So like when I enter my username and password, I click on that, I can view my balance, and it's the correct balance. And the total minimum payment is shown. So like if you owe $5,000 or 5,000 euros on your credit card, but you only need to make a payment of $100 or 100 euros, then the minimum payment is shown. And the payment due date is visible. So you can see when you have to make the payment. So that all totally makes sense. And if the due date is in the past, a notification pop-up appears on the screen. So this is a good example of like, okay, you don't need to get into the details of how it looks. You can just say like, see the attachment for the format of the pop-up window and what text needs to be there. That way it's in the acceptance criteria, but you don't have to get into the details in this particular space of all the particulars that need to show up on that window. Okay, and I've added a few links here on if you want to get into a little bit more information about user stories. I just added a few things here. This last one, Dan North, is he's an excellent resource for Agile stuff. And this particular post he has is about BDD and user stories. So it's fantastic. Highly recommend. Yeah, this is a super fun topic for me. So I love user stories, and I love talking to people about them. And yeah, so I appreciate everybody joining the call, and